operation to take back Raqqa from ISIS. You said that women played a key role in that. Exactly how did they do it, and what does it take to drive ISIS out of its own stronghold?
You know, Christy, ask any of the fighters and they'll tell you it takes a lot of willpower, a lot of heart, and a lot of courage. For many of the fighters that we were talking to, this was also personal, even if they weren't necessarily from Raqqa. And we're talking about the Syrian Defense Democratic Forces here. They're largely made up of Kurdish fighters, and these Kurdish fighters do have a female unit, and many of them are from the surrounding areas of northern Syria that are predominantly Kurdish. When ISIS came in and women were fleeing from Raqqa, they fled to these various different Kurdish villages and towns. Some of the fighters themselves are actually from Raqqa, and for the women, they take great pride in the fact that they say ISIS was driven out of Raqqa by women because of how brutal they were towards women and girls. In fact, the square where we're at, this is where they would sell female sex slaves, Yazidis, in what was described as an open-air market. And many of them are also expressing those very same concerns about the need to build Raqqa's social fabric moving forward. And it is so difficult for them because while on the one hand they are, yes, celebrating the fact that ISIS has largely been driven out, they've lost so many of their fellow fighters, both male and female at this stage, Christy.
That's right. There was a cost to pay to reach this result. And with the fall of Raqqa, ISIS has lost its own de facto capital. Do we know where the leaders of ISIS are? Where did they go?
Well, most analysts and observers wouldn't agree and say that the ISIS top-tier leadership, al-Baghdadi, his top commanders, fled Raqqa well before the battle even began. If we look at the territory that ISIS still controls, the front line is now shifted towards Deir ez-Zor. You still have ISIS territory in the Euphrates River Valley, the deserts of Al-Anbar province over in Iraq, and a few isolated pockets here and there. But the other thing that's important to point out is that while, yes, the death of Baghdadi and the top leadership would most certainly be significant, that doesn't necessarily mean an end to ISIS. ISIS has lost, yes, the capital of its so-called caliphate. They were driven out of Mosul, but they still have displayed an ability to inspire and order attacks abroad. If we look at history, the killing of Osama bin Laden did not mean the end of Al-Qaeda. If we look at the history of ISIS in and of itself, its previous incarnations were all declared defeated, their leaders killed, and yet ISIS managed to grow and thrive. And there is a lot of conversation right now about what needs to be done to prevent ISIS or something worse from reemerging.
Yeah, even though, as you point out, it's the end of the caliphate, still ISIS remains very much a threat all around the world, especially given those ISIS-inspired attacks. And could you tell us more about the human toll of ISIS in Raqqa? You mentioned a number of people in the military operation involved to clear out ISIS. There were many deaths there. Any latest understanding about the civilian toll of those who died in Raqqa during the occupation under ISIS and also during that coalition bombardment to drive the militants out?
Yeah, no organization at this stage has specific numbers, but if you just look at the destruction, if you look at what the bombardment has done, if you look at what the grenades, the fighting have done to the city itself, and ISIS was holding civilians hostage during this entire time frame. They weren't allowing people to leave. And imagine being here in the middle of all of this as a family, trying to keep yourself and your children safe. It's difficult to fully comprehend. The civilians are now being kept and have been for months living in these refugee camps that are outside of Raqqa. They're bursting at the seams. They barely have adequate humanitarian supplies, and aid organizations are warning of an even bigger humanitarian catastrophe because, as I was saying, the fighting has shifted to Deir ez-Zor, and international organizations are saying that there around 10,000 people a day are fleeing the fighting. We have spoken to some civilians in refugee camps. I mean, the stories they have make your skin crawl, your hair stand on end. To have endured all of that and they still don't really know when they're going to be able to come back, what they're going to come back to, or what their future is going to hold. What a lot of aid organizations are saying right now, Christy, is that it's also critical to do things like get kids back into school. All they've known for the last 5 years, because remember, Raqqa fell to ISIS well before Mosul, has been the ISIS way of life, that violence, that brutality, that ideology. And there is trauma. There is massive trauma amongst the population. And for the violence to end, these cycles need to be broken. These children, these people need to be shown something else. And that's why it's so important that aid organizations, the international community, that's what commanders are saying, really come together to provide Raqqa with the funding it needs to actually begin trying to rebuild, not just physically, but also socially.
Absolutely. Now is the time for healing, for rebuilding, rejuvenation in this community there that behind you is turned into a wasteland because of years of open conflict and being held by ISIS. Arwa Damon, we thank you so much for your reporting. Arwa Damon reporting live for us from Raqqa.